Hello, gents. Do you people see me? Is there a way for like other people to get on camera or whatever? We used to do that on. Does anyone remember Stickam? Stickam was really cool. I back in 2007, I would sit on Stickam for hours and hours. I actually had, I think, my first significant uh, engagements with atheists on Stickam. Um, sorry, Bane, I have a question. What is your view of the value of a debate on justification, especially limited to the bounds that yours was? Well, I think there aren't a lot of people out there, to be honest, who, at least from the Orthodox side, you're seeing more and more on the Catholic side, who make arguments for the legitimacy of tradition just based on Scripture taken on its own terms. And I think that such an argument is very valuable because even if one shows sola scriptura to be internally incoherent, then the way in which it is made intuitively credible is to show that tradition actually cashes out and serves to clarify the genuine meaning of Scripture. In the same way that I think the way that inerrancy is demonstrated to be legitimate, at least the way it was to me, is showing that it's useful. When you take for granted that Scripture cannot contradict itself, and so you use apparent contradictions as a stimulating question for research, it actually shows you more depths to the Scriptures that you would not have seen if you just said, oh, okay, I guess they contradict each other. And I would say the same thing is true for the tradition. The tradition is genuinely insightful as an exegesis of Scripture. Lewis, I didn't know that you actually have known of me since my days debating Venom Fang X. It's kind of bizarre how long it's been. It's been, I don't know, like 14 years. Thank you all for your kind words. Mango Bango. Hey, you mentioned that EO accepts original sin, but I always thought that they reject it. Can you expound on that, please? Well, as I am often disposed to say, it depends on what you mean by original sin. But even if one believes that the Roman Catholic teaching on our relation to Adam as regards sin is different from the Orthodox teaching, the two have never been opposed to each other by saying Orthodoxy does not teach original sin. If you look at Orthodox confessions of and catechisms, going back in the 19th century all the way back through the whole second millennium, original sin is affirmed in those words. So if one wanted to say there's a difference between that and the teaching at the Council of Trent, then one would have to, I think, make that argument using different terminology. The canons of the Council of Carthage affirm original sin, and there's both a Greek and a Latin recension of those canons, and those canons were included in various canonical collections in the Orthodox Church. So I would just say, despite the popularity of the idea that Orthodoxy and Catholicism differ on original sin, I'm not sure that it's very well grounded in the actual evidence. Do I read the works of Vladimir Moss? Yes, he's an interesting fella. Obviously he's an old calendarist, so I think that's problematic. But his work was the first to actually raise the question for me. Okay, is Alexander Calamiros actually faithfully representing the Orthodox tradition? And while I disagree with some of the stuff I've said, he's a creative thinker, so I enjoy his work. Let's see. Vane, you did an excellent job. Thank you. So I have been told that I should be a little more aggressive. I mean, the thing is, if you look back at my debate with Sami Zaatari and my debate famously with Matt Dillahunty, my behavior there, I'm just not a fan of that. I don't know. By God's will, we'll do another debate with Matt Slick at some point very soon. I appreciate that. Thank you, Taylor. I that's my disposition. I'm not a huge fan of being aggressive. Okay, so let's see. Thank you, Catholic Crusader Deus Volt. Let's see. You said that Slick may have misunderstood the gospel message. Well, what I meant by that is that I presented a view of the gospel. I said the gospel is the announcement of the victory of Christ and his consequent coronation, and that announcement is the power of God to salvation for all who believe. And Matt said, well, you didn't include all of this stuff, which is essential to the Orthodox gospel message. And my suggestion is just that if you believe that, then I don't think you understand what the actual significance of the sacramental life of the church is in the context of the gospel. The sacramental life, I mean, James White, and by the way, someone asked whether I would be interested in doing a debate with James White. You know, that's been the dream for years. I tried to flatter James White into doing a debate with me. Unfortunately, the only direct engagement he's ever given me is by quoting something I said about, he has this argument that the papacy is obviously blasphemous because the Pope calls himself Holy Father, and well, that's a title for God in John chapter 17. And frankly, I just think that kind of argument is beneath him, because it's a ridiculous argument. Obviously, it depends on what you mean by the phrase Holy Father. And of course, there's a way in which the fatherhood of God is shared with human beings on all levels. So are there such people who are made fathers in Christ? Yes. Are there such people who are consecrated such that they can be spoken of as holy? Yes. So why is it intrinsically blasphemous to use the phrase Holy Father? Anyway, I said that, and he quoted it and said, look at how ridiculous this is. That's his only direct engagement with me. But the truth is, I find him kind of an endearing guy. And I would love to have a debate/dialogue with him and get to know him a little better. I find that his work on Islam, I think, is quite good. I find that his work improves depending on when he started studying a particular subject. So when he's developed his set of arguments, they don't really change. But given that he started studying Islam so late, he's much more professional and scholarly about it. But I would love to debate or have some kind of roundtable with James White at some point. We'll see. Super Boomer, thank you. That's very kind. Clarify the relationship between sin and the penalty. How many people are there right now? Oh, wait, are there really 106 people? Huh. Okay, so let's see. Clarify the relationship between sin and the penalty of sin. Why do the NT authors say that Christ took our sin as opposed to the penalty of our sin in particular? Well, what I tried to say here is that sin and the penalty for sin are coextensive in the sense that sin intrinsically leads to its consequences. A life lived poorly is going to produce negative consequences, even though the life lived poorly is not quite identical with its consequences. And the essence of a life lived poorly, the essence of sin, is separation or opposition to God, to man, to creation. And Christ, in his redeeming work, took on and became sin, in the words of St. Paul, in the sense that he was cut off in his conscious mind from God. And here's what I mean by that. Christ was never, in fact, cut off from God. And he knew that he wasn't cut off from God. He had absolute confidence of that. Nevertheless, he experienced the subjective feeling of what it's like to feel abandoned by God. And by the same token, Jesus, as a human being, developed a set of close friendships. I mean, it's really remarkable, this fact about the incarnation, that Jesus wanted the company of his close friends in the Garden of Gethsemane. And despite desiring that company, he found that his closest friends had abandoned him. And this fulfills the opposition that is created between Adam and his bride in the Garden of Eden. And finally, with respect to the creation, the man is opposed to the creation in virtue of his sin. Creation produces thorns and thistles, and Christ is crowned with thorns. And so in each of those respects, Christ takes on what it means for sin to be sin, while not committing sin according to the disposition of his will. Where are you getting this? that Jesus was psychotically, I think he means psychologically, cut off from God. Well, if you look, I think, at the Garden of the Gethsemane account, that's what's going on. Take this cup from me, I think, refers to the experience of feeling like God has abandoned you. And if you look at, and the real point here is, look at the Psalms that Jesus quotes. Look at the way that he understands his own crucifixion in the context of the Psalms. And throughout the Psalter, one of the major themes is the experience of the one who is praying, of experiencing what it means to be cut off from God while still expressing confidence that he is not in reality cut off from God. Let's see. Who else? Okay. Yeah, I did think that it was a little strange how he seemed to latch on to the word ontology and tried to make a whole kind of argument about it, where, I tried to be clear, ontology just means that the quality by which we are justified is something which is made internal to ourselves rather than an extrinsic righteousness. Do I think that boomers will ever understand presuppositionalism and question their worldview? That is an interesting way of framing it. I think Greg Bahnsen himself was a boomer, wasn't he? Wasn't Bahnsen a boomer? So, how do I have so much? How do I have so much patience? Practice, I guess. I mean, the reality is that I've been doing this kind of thing for a very long time, and so I've forever embedded the consciousness of my 13 and 14-year-old self in the collective unconscious of the internet. So if you want to see what it looks like to be profoundly impatient, you can find the record there. But over time, I think what I realized is that the word of King Solomon, a kind word turns away wrath, is actually true. I mean, it sounds like a nice thing to say, but that it's actually true has profound implications. You look, for example, at a lot of these atheists who sound very, these guys are never going to listen to you. That's the first impression you get. But I remember very vividly, I think when I was like 18 or 19 years old, there was an atheist who messaged me on AIM and was making fun of me. And I decided, just as kind of like a social experiment, that I was going to just be really nice. And literally, his disposition, his tone immediately changed. And he ended up going to church and becoming a Christian. So I learned on that day that it is a serious mistake to assume that someone's mind is closed just because they say all sorts of silly stuff and they're really nasty at the first. You never know what's inside a person. So it's part of it is a pragmatic thing. Being nice just works better. Speaking the truth in love, a lot of people read that as speaking the truth is love, but that's not the case. Speaking the truth is not love. Speaking the truth in love means that there's a way to speak the truth without love. Let's see. Nathaniel J. Franco, could you repeat your question? I didn't catch it. I mentioned sin nature. Sin nature. Well, as I love saying, it depends on what you mean by that. The phrase sin nature, I'm not a fan of at all, because the nature that we have is human nature, and human nature cannot be sinful because it's created in the image of God. Nevertheless, I'm not sure that when most people say sin nature, their concept really excludes that. It's just a poor and imprecise way of framing the issue. Yeah, Sean, I think that that's an important point, and I wish I had emphasized that a little more. That faith, according to the Protestant view, does not justify, or according to his view at least, does not justify you. It's rather the imputed righteousness of Christ which justifies you. If I ever considered that you are a Sigma male, I'm not sure I even want to know what that means. Lewis, is it possible for an Eastern Orthodox to affirm unconditional election? No, I don't believe that you can. Do you think that if you deepened your familiarity with the fathers, your ability to understand Scripture would be deepened. Yeah, without question. I'm not illiterate with respect to the fathers, but I do know the Bible better than the fathers. But it's always kind of an internal dialogue. You always want to be studying the fathers and the Scriptures at the same time, and you relate them to each other. And in so doing, you can understand both in a more profound way. Let's see. Do Calvinists believe that evil has an ontological existence? And if so, wouldn't that end in some form of dualism? Now, I don't think Calvinists would, by and large, say that. But if you want to say something like God unconditionally elects some people to damnation and some to salvation because he wants to reveal the whole range of his attributes, both love and wrath, well, then I think that would suggest that evil is somehow necessary for God to make himself known, which would lead to that conclusion. But I don't think they themselves would reason consistently in that respect. Does 2 Corinthians 5:21 say that Christ was made sin or a sin offering? That's an interesting question. I think I would I think that if you look at the way that the word sin is used in the Old Testament, you can see that sometimes in the same passage it can be used in two different ways. And so it's not necessarily one or the other kind of thing. Let's see. Lewis asked about the Septuagint. Yeah, the Septuagint, one of the things that it's most useful for is the question of vocalization. And vocalization, if you're not familiar with, is the question of which vowels are present in the word. Because if you look at Hebrew writing, the vowels are written kind of above and below the letters, and that's because the vowels weren't part of the original text, so there had to be a vowel system added afterwards. So some words can be vocalized in multiple ways depending on which vowels you read there. And so the Septuagint often provides alternative vocalizations. There are also some very important alternative readings the Septuagint provides, for example, in Numbers 24, where it says about the Messiah, his kingdom shall be higher than Agag in the Masoretic, but in the Septuagint, his kingdom shall be higher than Gog, as in Gog, king of Magog. And Ezekiel 38 says that Gog was prophesied in the former days. So the Septuagint is accurate there, but I don't really follow the view that the Septuagint is the irrevocably standard text which is preserved from the corruptions of the Masoretic tradition. I don't see evidence that the Masoretic tradition was corrupted to exclude Christ. And the reason I say that is because it's easy to demonstrate. Deuteronomy 32:8 is another instance where the Septuagint is superior. The reason I say that is because I can easily demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah from the Masoretic textual tradition. And in fact, in the Orthodox liturgical tradition, there are certain Masoretic readings which are preserved in contrast to the Septuagint. A most important example being Isaiah 9, he shall be called Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and so on and so forth. The Septuagint says Angel of Great Counsel, but the Masoretic is a more clear affirmation of the divinity of Jesus, and it's the Masoretic reading which is included in the Orthodox liturgical tradition. Can you address the issue of whether saints using insults is a good argument for lay people using them routinely against non-Orthodox? Well, I remember when I was younger, it was easy to say, well, Jesus insulted the Pharisees. Jesus said this and that about the Pharisees, so I'm just imitating Jesus. But the reality is that that's not why I was doing it. I was doing it just because that was my disposition, to be a nasty guy. So are there contexts where it's okay to be highly polemical like that? Yes. Basil the Great in his Against Eunomius is quite amusing, and he's very funny in making fun of Eunomius. There are some arguments where you have to be somewhat dismissive because the argument isn't worth taking seriously. And it's important, in order to help other people from taking that argument seriously, to not take it seriously. But I would say you really have to, it's better to be nice if you are not sure which way to go. As to whether I agree with Catholic soteriology, I would say yes. I agree with Catholic soteriology. Let's see. Mick Fine, it is good to see you again. I haven't talked with you in a long time. Is there a unified theodicy in Orthodoxy? I don't feel qualified to answer that question. Which point from Matt's like bothered you the most from this debate? Well, I don't feel particularly bothered about anything, but I would say if anything frustrated me, I think it was the insistence that simply quoting two passages which refer to debt was self-explanatory. Mikek, I'm not sure that I quite understand your question. I mean, there are, of course, textual difficulties in the Masoretic textual tradition. My favorite kind of pizza is cheese. So, sorry. Kind of boring. I'm most bothered by him poo-pooing on theosis. I actually was kind of surprised by that. I would have expected him to say, well, in one sense we can affirm theosis, and in another sense we can't. Does an ordo salutis exist in Orthodoxy? Well, if one simply means an order in which God works to transform a person into the glory of Christ, then yeah, it does exist in Orthodoxy. There is a definitive order to the transformation of the human being. Yeah, I actually do like pineapple pizza. Sorry. As for Jonathan Pageau, yeah, I do like him. I like Father Damick. I like Father De Young. I would love to have a discussion with them at some point. Let's see. There was a question I wanted to. Am I going to debate Muslims and atheists? Muslims, definitely. We'll see about atheists. Probably. How many hours do I spend reading? It's less than you might assume. Honestly, I eventually learned that it was no use to try to force myself to read, and I didn't need to read the entire book. Like, there was a time where I have to read this entire book. If I start something, I have to finish it. But I ended up boring myself to death reading things that I wasn't really learning anything from. So I read what I'm interested in reading when I'm interested in it, and it's relatively rare for me to like read a book from beginning to end these days. There's there's a pattern of divine activity where God breathes out and then he breathes back in. He extends himself out into the world processively, and then in virtue of the world being constituted by that self-extension of God, it reverts back into him. So it's kind of the same with studying stuff. There are periods where I don't talk very much about anything theological, but I just do a lot of reading. And then I'll go through a period where there will just be a burst of lots and lots of videos or articles, which kind of help me digest everything that I've processed. So that's kind of the pattern of my study, if you want to call it that. Did I change my position on evolution? Well, what did you last hear? I mean, yeah, I am a young earther these days. That happened like 7 years ago. I have a section on my blog specifically about this. Let's see, dude. Nathaniel, on sacramental rigorism, at some point, yeah, but I kind of want to stick at this point to stuff which is less controversial than that. I'd rather speak at this point to things which pretty much all Orthodox are agreed upon, because I think those are the most important questions. Once I've kind of gotten a good amount of stuff out there about that, I might say something about sacramental rigorism. Hold on. There's my articles on creationism. Am I interested in secular philosophy? It depends on what you mean by secular philosophy, because I don't think anything is innately or secular. Everything bears some kind of relationship to God and to Christ. But if you mean philosophy by secular people, then I guess someone like John Searle might qualify, given that he's a naturalist, and he argues against reductive naturalism with respect to the mind, and that's kind of interesting. Does Orthodoxy offer political theology? Well, yes, in that it does have a theological interpretation of politics. What books would I recommend on the topic? It's an interesting book. I haven't read the whole thing. In fact, I haven't read most of it, so I'm not going to this is a great book. I've read it from beginning to end like 3 times, and what a smarty pants. But let me try to find it. It is good from what I've read. Do I believe theistic evolution is heretical? Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by that. But I have said on my blog, no, I don't consider those who are theistic evolutionists to be heretics. I think that it can create certain dangers which could lead in that direction. But it's possible for somebody to be woefully inconsistent about their own view, which is looking back kind of where I was and where I think a lot of theistic evolutionists are. Will I change my hairstyle due to Matt Slick's criticism? The hair has kind of been a major theme running through my life. No, I think it's all right now. I had there's a time where it was quite long, which was when I got the selfie that was posted on the debate advertisement. But the upshot of that is that some days it was a great hair day. I'm a very vain person. Some days it was a great hair day, and some days it was just awful. And I would rather have something a little more consistent. Let's see. Okay. I have not read Noam Chomsky's work on language. The parallels between Ephesians 2:1-11 and Colossians 2:11-13. Well, I think that I actually think that the letter to the Ephesians is the letter to the Laodiceans, that it was a circular letter which was read in multiple churches, and according to the church at which it was read, it was labeled by the name of that particular church. Let's see. I have no intelligent things to say about Noam Chomsky or Joan of Arc. Thank you, Vach, or however you pronounce that. I appreciate that. There was a book, what was it called? Kingdom of Speech, which was like, I have a review of it on Amazon. It's like this huge anti-Chomsky book, but I don't really get what the point of it was, because it affirms, instead of Chomsky's view, the view of a guy named Everett. But Everett himself speaks at like the Freedom from Religion Foundation. He's worse than Chomsky when he talks about religion. So it was kind of interesting. But if you ever call me senpai again, I will call a hit on you. So keep that in mind, bucko. Oh, geez. Why would you... my thoughts, I don't know if I should answer this. Okay. Those who call themselves race realists, I find that they assume that just because their views are politically incorrect, that they must be based in very sound argumentation. So I would certainly not identify with them. And frankly, I don't want to comment any further, because this is really important for my own financial security. And if I ever got taken off YouTube, and by the way, my views are not really that ban-worthy, but you just better safe than sorry. I'm a big unionist. I moved to Virginia from Missouri, and I couldn't believe it that there were like people who like defended the Confederacy. And so ever since 4th grade, I've been arguing with people about the Confederacy. I used to have videos on my Cabane 52 account going after neo-Confederates. They were very cringeworthy, but still, I have an interest in the American Civil War, and I certainly am not a neo-Confederate. Israel versus Palestine. Well, the Palestinians probably have the worst diplomats in the world, in that these UN guys have been pretending or acting as if they have any leverage. They have no leverage whatsoever. Why exactly are the Palestinians demanding East Jerusalem? Okay, first of all, there's no such thing as East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem was a brief political circumstance after the 1948 war, where part of the city of Jerusalem was not under Israeli control, but it was not a distinct entity prior to the 1948 war. Second of all, even if it was, it's ludicrous to demand the world from the Israelis when they have no leverage to give. I am very sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinian people, but I think that they need to be pragmatic if they want to get anything. And I think, quite honestly, the Israelis love the current situation where they are, where the Palestinians are demanding the world, because it gives them an excuse to simply ignore negotiations, continue to settle in those areas which are supposed to be part of a future Palestinian state, and they can just settle them out of existence until it ceases to be a question anymore. Okay, my thoughts on Zionism? Well, that's a complicated question. I do have a video on Israel and the church that might pertain to something, but it would be difficult to give a short answer that wouldn't immediately be framed as either he's an anti-Semite or he's a Zionist. Let's see. David Bentley Hart, I think, is ill. I think that he has lost the ability to even hypothetically consider a set of circumstances in which he might be incorrect. I mean, I've met him in person. He's just in person. He's just like he is online. His arguments for universalism are no good. His arguments for pretty much anything these days are no good. I think something must have happened to him in the past 10 years, because he used to write very insightful stuff. You look at the article, Therapeutic Superstition. It's a fantastic article. It's on First Things. And it's not just that he agrees with me on this. It's that he seemed to really be a fundamentally different person. So we all should be praying for David Bentley Hart. I think, honestly, there should be a group of people who agree to do a 40-day daily prayer thing for David Bentley Hart, because I think something must have happened to him that really wounded him in the past 10 years. Let's see. Calvinism. Well, no, I don't think Calvinism would entail that prayer is useless, because I think that even on a deterministic view, God might determine that the efficient cause of certain of his predestinated actions would be prayer. So he might determine that he would create certain people as an instrument by which his ends would be realized. So I don't think prayer would render it intrinsically useless. Ray Gregory Santos, the Rosary. The Rosary is a great prayer. It has a Byzantine form. It was so a lot of people will call it the Rosary of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, but it's actually the Rosary of Saint Seraphim of Zadansk. It's a Saint Seraphim who was a new martyr in 1918. So if you're interested, you can look that up. Personally, for me, I found it's very useful. So I do a daily rosary with a friend of mine every night at 9 p.m. And it is extremely useful for me. I know it's been very useful for him, and I would recommend you guys give it a shot. So, St. John. Okay. St. Nicholas fan. What do you think after our conversation about St. John not dying? You are Jared, right? Hey, Jared Emery. What's going on, man? I think Matt Slick's view is it has no basis in the text whatsoever. I don't think that's what James is talking about. I don't think there's any evidence that James is talking about that. James refers to some of the same texts that Paul refers to in speaking about justification. Oh boy. Hold on, I'm looking away from the thing for a moment. Lovely. Okay. Okay, 1 second. DN, yes, I can see it. Blawman W, I decline to answer that question. I decline to answer it because I think, from experience, I think that it's easy to become very obsessive about certain apparitions. And whether one's talking about Orthodox or Catholic apparitions or the relationship between the two. So I don't feel comfortable even speaking about them publicly. If I was to comment on them, I would rather do so one-on-one with a person who I think would be in a good position to talk about it. Nathaniel's the fact St. James and Paul both use the example of Abraham, proof that they're speaking of the exact same thing, pointing to faith as active participation. I would say that, first of all, we shouldn't refer to Abraham as an example, as if he's just kind of plucked out of a basket of Old Testament characters. Abraham is described, in his experience of justification, is described because it is the Abrahamic covenant within which a person is justified, such that Abraham's experience, in virtue of the structure of that covenant, is programmatic for the experience of anyone who is justified. I think that the fact that James refers to Genesis 15 suggests, at the very least, that he is not speaking about justification before men. I think he's speaking about whether faith is effective without works. And he doesn't say that works demonstrate faith, and such that if one doesn't have works, one doesn't have faith. Works do demonstrate faith, but that's not the point that he's making. It's rather that works proceed from faith, they perfect faith, and they allow faith to accomplish its goal. Brought up the inheritance. Michael, yeah, I brought up the inheritance of the land, and I wish we had more time to talk about it, because if you look at Paul in Romans 4, what does he say? He says, the promise that Abraham and his seed would be the heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. So the question of inheritance is what undergirds any discussion of justification. The reason that James, I think, cites Rahab is because there's a note in the book of Joshua saying that Rahab had an inheritance in the land of Israel. Inheriting the land is connected to the inheritance of the world to come, and that is what was promised. Theosbound, what is the best argument for young age creation outside the Bible? I would say it is the reality that virtually every culture where we have an extant mythology has a tradition of a global flood. And some people will say, well, floods happen everywhere. Problem is, you do not see in areas where there are frequent earthquakes, there are not analogous global earthquake stories. But even in desert areas where floods don't happen, you see traditions of a global flood. And in areas where floods do happen a lot, you often have traditions of a large local flood, which is explicitly distinguished from the tradition of a global flood. And these traditions of a global flood are not just traditions that a global flood happened. It's rather much more specific, where there are particular details which are shared. For example, in various Native American traditions, there is a bird, sometimes even a raven, who is sent off at the end of the flood. Now, how in the world if these two stories are created independently, how in the world did they acquire that very specific convergence? Well, a global flood would not necessarily confirm a young Earth, but here's the reason why a global flood is very relevant to a young Earth. Because the basis for saying that the Earth is of great antiquity is the sedimentary record, right? Now, a flood would have left geological evidence. That's just in the nature of the case. A flood would leave geological evidence. Now, if the sedimentary record is being interpreted correctly within the conventional geological framework, then we should find evidence of a global flood on top of the antiquity of these billion-year-old rocks, but we don't. So the alternative to that is to say that we do have great evidence for a global flood, but it is being misinterpreted as evidence for the great antiquity of the Earth, and that much of the fossil record is, in fact, a product of the flood. So, there's lots of bad arguments for young age creation, so you have to be very careful about who you trust. But there are also some good arguments out there. What do I think of the claims by AIG, the names of Noah's sons carried through the mists of cultures outside the A&E? I think that's true. AIG is very inconsistent, so you have to know who is writing the article in order to know whether to trust it or not. Was it Wilhelm Schmidt that collected Genesis style? No, Wilhelm Schmidt did original monotheism. So he collected traditions of the worship of the supreme creator God from around the world. Yeah, and it's also interesting that you don't just have these traditions which parallel a global flood, but you also have traditions paralleling the Tower of Babel. And in fact, you've got traditions which sound very much like the narrative that you see in Genesis 2, the creation of man. You have one tradition which I really like. It says that woman was created first, and then man was created from the side of the woman. Clearly, there's a relationship here. That's a Native American tradition. It's very difficult to explain how this could have arisen independently, especially given that this is not an isolated instance, but you find stuff like that all across the world. Have I read Father Seraphim's book? No, I haven't read it straight through, but I do have it. I've read a large part of it. John, yes, that's absolutely true. And it's interesting that if you look at many of these traditions, it speaks of a great wind blowing over the cosmic tree or the cosmic tower at which the world's languages were created. Now, the Bible doesn't refer to this great wind, but Josephus does. So that suggests that Josephus had access to certain traditions which were outside the Bible, but which are verified if you look at traditions which you find in ancient China, in ancient America, and so on and so forth. Nations migrate. They are not teleported. No, I don't work out, but I should. Mr. E. How many times did you guys ask that? Like 5, 6 times? Yes, John, that's a good point. It's an example of how typology is not just a literary feature, but it's a real feature of human history. Lewis, I have not decided on the topic for my doctoral dissertation because I am not doing a doctoral dissertation because I'm not in a doctoral program. I just finished my THM, so it's kind of a master's for those who already have a master's. And so I did a master's thesis, which was on the relationship between the theology of the Book of Exodus and the theology of Dionysius the Areopagite. No, I've never been doing a PhD. On theosis, I would say probably a good book would be Michael Gorman's Inhabiting the Cruciform God. I would say that as far as Muslims go, it depends on the person. One of my closest friends is a convert from Islam, so God will do what God does. The the Holy Fool tradition. I have no good books to recommend on it, but I will say that the Holy Fool tradition is pretty clearly rooted in the activity of the biblical prophets. You take someone like Isaiah, for example, who walks around naked for 3 years in Jerusalem in order to teach Israel a lesson. You take Ezekiel, who cooks bread over human dung in order to demonstrate something to Israel. The kinds of stuff that the Holy Fools do is rooted in the prophetic tradition. Saint Xenia is one of my favorite saints. Yes, I do avoid talking about church politics because I think it's ecclesiastical gossip that really is. I can't see what good it does. I mean, I don't think we should air our dirty laundry. As to Rasputin, I love heterodox and revisionist academic stuff, but I would say I have never looked at that question. And there are saints, I think, who have said Rasputin was a nasty guy. So, but I haven't looked at it. Cryptids depends on the cryptid. I think some of the cryptids are devils. I think some of them are genuine animals who have not. For example, there are pretty clearly two kinds of Bigfoot sightings. One of them is supernatural, and the other one is pretty clearly a kind of animal. So we do know from the fossil record that there were apes who walked upright. And if you do statistical Brahmanology, they do not look to have been in the same Brahman as human beings. So I think some of the Bigfoot sightings are probably a almost extinct ape, but other ones seem to be more supernatural in nature. As for Tolkien, I actually am just now reading or listening to Lord of the Rings. For the first time. So I'm enjoying it, but I love the introduction to the Silmarillion on the Cosmic Orchestra. A Brahmanology is basically the discipline where you try to identify which kinds of biological organisms were created independently and which kinds are descended from a common ancestor. It's a creationist kind of subdiscipline. Sure, I think the Shroud of Turin is authentic. I have no answer to the question of pews or no pews. As to dinosaurs, well, I think that the universality of traditions about dinosaurian-like creatures, which are called dragons, is pretty good evidence that there must have been some kind of experience with dinosaurs. I don't think it's a good argument to say that people were just looking at fossils and developed their traditions on that basis. I think it's interesting if you look at contemporary witnesses of pterosaurs. Most people are familiar with the pterosaurs who have tails. Okay, so that's what you'll see in the media. The typical pterodactyl is going to have a tail. There is another kind of pterosaur which doesn't have a tail, which is attested from the fossil record, but it's not very widely spread in the media. But almost all of the claimed witnesses to living pterosaurs are the non-tailed ones. So if they were just deriving this from the media, then one would expect the description of the animal they allegedly saw to resemble that which is shown in the media, rather than the one which is there in the fossil record, but which is not as well known. So I think that's an interesting thing. Thank you, David Julius. I appreciate the call. I do not believe the moon landing was fake. Jesse, yes, because the faith works relation is analogized to the body spirit relation. I would love to debate I will debate the Diamond Brothers any day of the week on the primacy of the Pope. Elastic Giraffe. Well, I think that the doctrine of the energies is a doctrine about the Logos. I do think that sometimes it's been articulated in separation from that, and that's a mistake. Why young age creation over old age creation? Well, because I think young age creation is true. I know that sounds kind of pedantic, but old age creation, it doesn't help me with the traditions of a universal flood. It doesn't help me with the traditions of the Tower of Babel. It doesn't help me with what's the prima facie straightforward interpretation of the historical sense of Genesis 1 to 11. I just think that old age creation, it doesn't have very many advantages over theistic evolution. Why do I think the moon landing is real? Well, because I think that I think the analysis of moon rocks is just easiest to explain if the moon landing actually happened. I mean, I see no reason prima facie to disbelieve in the moon landing. I have a friend who argues that the moon landing happened, but the video recording of it is a fake, which is kind of interesting. Are there any non-Christian scientists who are young Earth? Not that I'm familiar with. There may be some Jewish scientists who are young Earth. If people want to be vegans, they can be vegans. There are prophetic words by some elders who speak of a time where all mankind will be vegetarians. So, eating meat is something which began after the flood. So it's possible that at some point that will be reversed, but who knows? Well, the nature is, how does the inheritance of the land, like its imagery, pertain to salvation? What about it besides the word inheritance helps us understand the kingdom of come? Well, what it means to be saved is to become a ruler over the world to come. And if you look at Isaiah 65 to 66, Isaiah 65 to 66 uses the language of Numbers 14 in order to explain the coming of the new heavens and the new earth. And Numbers 14 speaks of the possession by Israel of the promised land. And so this connection between the entire creation renewed in the Messiah and the inheritance of the land of the Old Covenant is not something that's new for Paul. It's something which is done in Isaiah and other prophets as well. I didn't mention Matthew 25 because I wanted to stick to those texts which explicitly address justification, specifically Paul, because I think that's where they plant their flag. So I wanted to go after that where they plant their flag specifically. If we had a much longer period of time, the time for our opening statements and rebuttals is a little shorter than I think it ought to have been. And I was the one who came up with those times, so it's my fault. In the future, I'd probably have them 15, 20 minutes. But if I had more time, I would have gone to something like that. A fallen and unfallen human nature are not two separate natures. To speak of a fallen nature is to speak of human nature having a wound in virtue of its descent from Adam. Christ, in taking on human nature, could have been immortal from day one. He didn't have to embrace corruption in virtue of becoming a human being. That was a free act of Christ that is distinct from the act of the incarnation itself. As to the vaccine, My answer to that is that it is a Romans 14 type thing. We should not pass judgment either way because of the vaccine. Some people have very strong opinions. My own point of view is that I don't want to have a strong opinion about anything which I haven't studied very carefully. And I haven't studied it very carefully, so I don't have a strong opinion. I haven't read enough Josiah Trenum to really give an intelligent comment. I am not vaccinated. I may get the vaccine because I want to visit my friend in the UK in the next few months or so. He's just had a baby, and it'll just make it easier for me to do that. So, we'll see. What face? As to postmillennialism, do we find it in the fathers? One thing that I've discovered lately is that in Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant theology, there is a thread. I literally do not know what face. There is a thread of hopeful eschatology, but it tends to not be called postmillennialism in outside of the Reformed tradition. I think Athanasius and Augustine, they have a hopeful view of eschatology. They expect the conquest of the nations by Christ. I think there are some passages in Maximus which indicate that he's going in that direction. Father Steneloi, I think, definitely goes in that direction. There are a fair few Catholic theologians in the past few centuries who've gone in that direction. I think Bonaventure did. But it's a good topic for someone to do in a dissertation, because this a thread of hopeful eschatological optimism has not really been considered as a category of itself, which has been studied. So it'd be useful. Let's see. Yeah, we'll see about inspiring philosophy at some point. Maybe. I had a back and forth in the comments with him about it. Honestly, if somebody wants to be a theistic evolutionist, fine, but just don't say things like creationism is bad theology. I mean, come on. Let's be. It sounds really nice, but let's be serious people here. There's no question at all that young age creation was the normative view of the church prior to Laelian geology. Now, what that means, we can talk about, but don't say things like young age creationism was invented by Seventh-day Adventists. That's just not true. And I would have said that, by the way, as a theistic evolutionist, and did say that as a theistic evolutionist. Yeah, we'll see about the priesthood. Maybe not. I don't know. It's not something I'm actively pursuing at this point. If you could get a clear, 100% accurate biblical interpretation of any verse in the Bible right now, which verse would you pick? I would pick 1 Corinthians chapter 11. This is one of the toughest passages. Let me read it here. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, and every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, for he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman wears long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. So I don't have a problem with this, like oh, that's not very progressive or whatever. But the logic of the text is, I've made some progress on it, but it's quite opaque. What's the actual inner logic of this text? Okay. To Brent, I am not a pacifist, and I would recommend those interested in the question read C.S. Lewis's excellent essay, Why I Am Not a Pacifist. If you're interested in the best geological case for a global flood for young Earth, the only book to read is Leonard Brand's Faith, Reason, and Earth History. That book is so much better than any other book which is out there. It's not even funny. So check it out. Well, yeah, I mean, oh, wait, I don't know. My Patreon is, someone asked for the link. So, oh, I got a new patron. That's lovely. Honestly, guys, wow, someone just pledged, got a big, elite patron. So thank you very much for whoever that was. Honestly, it does make me feel very awkward promoting my Patreon like this, but the reality is that it really is instrumental in terms of doing these debates regularly, in terms of producing this content on a regular basis, and producing good content rather than just like 5-minute little videos. So someone asked for the link, so I'll put it in the comments. Okay, let's see. I think I can. Oh, great. Oh crap! That's not the wrong link in. That's not the link. It is. Oh. Okay. All right. There's the link to my Patreon. So, as I say in my videos, if you are in a financially good situation and you enjoy the content that I produce, please do consider becoming a patron at one of the 3 tiers. The second tier, which is $10, I think is the tier that I mean for most people to sign up for by default. That's going to get you pretty much almost all of the content that I produce. And the elites, that's the $20 a month patronage, that's going to get you a guaranteed hour. We can talk on the phone about anything you want to talk about. Again, I feel awkward. It feels a little cringe putting it out there like that, but it is what it is. Okay, I'll put it in the video description. Yeah, no, I do need to actually continue that series with my brother. I think there's like 1 or 2 more parts of the interview. Me and him recently moved into a new place, and so we live together, so we can do it anytime, really. I mean, maybe I should do it tomorrow. I have not read Joshua Swamidass. I actually have not even heard of him. Mhm. Mm, mm, doo-doo-doo. As to which church father I found most beneficial to study, it's kind of a cliche answer, but Maximus the Confessor. I've heard the name Gospel Simplicity before, but I don't know immediately who you're referring to. What would the discussion be about? I was off of the tab for a little while. Am I a fan of Jordan Peterson? I think he's got a lot of good things to say. I'd be happy to have a discussion with Jordan Cooper. I'd be happy to go on Trent Horn's podcast. I am familiar with Kierkegaard, but I've never read him. My brother has read Kierkegaard. I have no good answer to your question about what a good gospel harmony would be. Wow, a lot of you just became patrons. Thank you so much. Seriously, it is profoundly helpful. Thank you so much. On Graham Hancock, I think I would see a lot of the things that they cite as memories of antediluvian civilization, but I haven't looked into it in great depth. Should Orthodox bishops speak out against abortion and LGBTQ? Yes. I'd be happy to debate the Diamond Brothers. I think Ubi Petrus has pretty much taken care of criticizing them. Ubi Petrus is really the guy to go to if you want to look at a Catholic Orthodox critique of Catholic apologetics. Chase, the reason that I think it's authentic is that I think, first of all, there is a chain of documentation for the presence of the shroud that precedes the time when it was allegedly made, according to the carbon dating that was done. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that pertains to the authenticity of the shroud. For example, one of the things that's always really struck me is that the nails in the shroud are in the wrists of Christ, whereas any medieval artist of the crucifixion would have it in his palms. There's a lot of other things that could be said about it, but I just find it to be a simpler and more parsimonious explanation of the data to hold that it's authentic. Sean, I don't know if I could answer that question directly, but I think what I'd like to do is to take a particular section of scripture, like Romans 1-3, and debate Matt on that. That, I think, is probably the next step to take, to line by line work through a particular text. I think that has the potential to be productive. Yeah, Romans 9 is actually, Romans 9 was my first idea. I would like to start with a text that pertains to justification, Romans 1-3, maybe Galatians 2-3, but I would love to have that Romans 9 debate. I have no thoughts on the future of the Anglican Communion, except to say it doesn't seem particularly promising. Favorite New Testament book? 2 Corinthians. James Jordan's view on justification, I am not familiar with, but Peter Leithart's view seems to me to be approaching indistinguishability from Orthodox and Catholic teaching. If you look at his book, Delivered from the Elements of the World, it's getting closer and closer to Orthodox and Catholic teaching. Actually, one thing I was surprised by, in a good way, with Matt tonight is that he did not go all out against the subjective genitive reading of Pistis Christou. I expected him to come all out against that, but he didn't. So that was interesting. SpongeBob used to, my mother banned me from watching SpongeBob because she saw the episode. Remember when he was doing like the dolphin sounds and she thought it made light of cursing? So I was banned from watching it for a little while, but then she unbanned it. And I was a fan of SpongeBob. But I haven't seen, actually, I did watch an episode of SpongeBob like a couple months ago, but I don't know that I've been an active fan as of late. Yeah, Keaton, I was quite surprised by the way that he framed the relationship between the two testaments. Sorry, guys. 1 second. Someone asked, is it correct to say that the one and the many are equally ultimate in the Trinity? I would say yes, that is correct. All right, folks, I'm gonna get off in a few moments. Anything else that you guys want to talk about before we cut it off? Thank you, Dylan. Will I do any videos on Maximus in the near future? I have no specific plans to do anything on Maximus specifically in the near future. So before I get off, I am going to plug my Patreon one last time. So in the chat, there's the link to the Patreon. If you're in a good place and you enjoy the content, I'd really appreciate it. That I appreciate everybody who just watches. Let's see. Yeah, I know. I do think that the cosmos is finite. Does the Spirit speak to believers in Orthodoxy? Yeah. I mean, the most uncontroversial aspect of that would be those ascetic saints who have the gift of prophecy. But I think it probably extends beyond that. Okay, folks. So I will see you sometime soon. This will be the video for tonight. By God's will, I will have another video tomorrow. And I want to thank all of you for participating. It's been nice. And I want to thank all of you for watching the debate and for your very kind words. So I will see you all later.